Hi everyone, I'm excited to announce that the 8-week online Transcend course is back. Become certified in learning the latest science of human potential and learn how to live a more fulfilling, meaningful, creative, and self-actualized life. The new cohort starts on June 25th and will include more than 10 hours of recorded lectures, 4 live group Q&A sessions with me, 4 small group sessions with our world-class faculty, a plethora of resources and articles to support your learning, and an exclusive workbook of growth challenges that will help you overcome your deepest fears and grow as a whole person. There are even some personalized self-actualization coaching spots available with our world-class faculty as an add-on. I'm happy to announce that just for Psychology Podcast listeners, you can get 20% off the course by going to transcendcourse.com and entering Psych Podcast in the coupon box. We will be closing registration soon, so I suggest signing up as soon as possible. We have so much fun in this course, and you will receive a lot of support along your self-actualization journey. Just go to transcendcourse.com to register and enter PSYCHPODCAST, Psych Podcast, in the coupon box. I look forward to welcoming you to the Transcender community.
It talks about going from that awareness to a vast emptiness to an ultimate unity or oneness with everything. Yes. And that's a waking up experience.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today we welcome Ken Wilber to the show. Ken Wilber is the legendary developer of integral theory. He is also the founder of the Integral Institute, which was formed in collaboration with over 200 scholars and experts, specializing in education, politics, business, medicine, psychology, spirituality, law, and criminal justice. His 25 books have been translated into 30 foreign languages, making Ken one of the most widely translated academic writers in America. At age 74, he is still very much active as a philosopher, author, and teacher, with all of his major publications still in print. In this episode, I talked to Ken Wilber about his integral theory. Instead of trying to tackle it all in its complexity, Ken hones in on the application of his theory to intelligence, consciousness, and transcendence. He believes that development in these areas follows a predictable path, such as in the case of enlightenment. Borrowing from Zen Buddhism, Ken talks about what it's like to awaken to the truth of reality. We also touch on the topics of psychological research, diversity, artificial intelligence, social media, and of course, we talked about Abraham Maslow. So without further ado, I bring you Ken Wilber. Hey, Ken Wilber, it is such an honor to chat with you today. It's been a long time coming.
Thanks, buddy. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to start off by asking, how are you doing? How are you doing?
You bet. I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
Good. I mean, there's such a huge wealth of information that you've put out into the world throughout your course of your whole lifetime.
Right.
What are some of the applications of integral theory that most excite you these days?
Well, I appreciate the developmental component a lot, and the fact that everybody is going through a certain stage of development in one or more of their multiple intelligences. And so the number of multiple intelligences a person has, it varies from theorist to theorist. Most give around 8 or so multiple intelligences, some 9 or 10, but they're all important. I mean, we have not only a cognitive intelligence, we have an emotional intelligence, a moral intelligence, an aesthetic intelligence, an interpersonal intelligence, a spiritual intelligence, and so on. And for each of those intelligences, we're going through a given number of around 8 or so stages of development. And that's a very important piece of information, because not only can you identify different multiple intelligences that you have, you can recognize that each of them will be coming from essentially the same level of development, although they go through it at different speeds and at different times and so on. But that's an important piece of information to know and understand. And it's one of the favorite aspects that I have for integral theory. So I appreciate that. Now, we have different states of consciousness. Commonly, they're waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and then one called Turiya, which is a transcendental self-awareness. It's your awareness of your independent individual self right now. There's a huge witness, this witnessing yourself. And so when you look within and see yourself, you're in touch with the witness experience. And that witness is actually your true self, or Turiya, or your real self, or your big self. And that witness is also one with everything you're witnessing right now, which is called the state of Turiyatita, which basically means beyond Turiya, or beyond identifying with this witness. You can notice that everything that you're aware of right now is actually existing, coming from a state that Douglas Harding called our headless condition. And what headless means is if you look, you can see every part of your body except your head, and you can't see your head. You're headless. What you see when you look out of your two eyes is you can see two sort of fleshy blobs on each side of your awareness. But then there's a whole world of objects that seem to be arising out there. But they're not really arising out there. They're arising right one with your own awareness. So they're sitting right where you thought your head was. Is an objective world arising out there. But it's not arising out there. It's arising right here, right where I thought my head used to be. So I really am headless, except I'm one with everything that's arising in my headless space.
Okay, let's take a pause for a second. Within the span of 3 minutes, you seamlessly rode between the multiple intelligences to the self to the being one with everything. There's so many juicy threads. Can we start with intelligence? Because I've spent my whole career studying intelligence and studying G, or general intelligence.
Sure.
Do you think, I have two questions relating to intelligence. One, do you think society overvalues certain forms? Which ones do you think society overvalues, and which ones do you think society undervalues, especially in education? And the second question is, do you see any value to general intelligence? Do you even believe there is such a thing? So there's two questions if we double click on intelligence for a second.
Yeah. So which ones do I think we overemphasize?
Yeah.
I think we definitely give a fair amount of attention to cognitive intelligence. And so that's whether it's an actual field like mathematics or some form of intelligence, very specific like that. But in general, we give a great deal of attention to whatever cognitive awareness we have, and not as much attention to like emotional intelligence or spiritual intelligence or even aesthetic intelligence. Although there are specific disciplines for each of those. And of course, if we sign up to one of those classes, we'll get a fair amount of attention paid to that intelligence. It might be our moral intelligence or our aesthetic intelligence or even our emotional intelligence. And what was your second question? I didn't understand it when you first said it.
Sure. It was about general intelligence, but let's close the thread on the first thing first. The idea of multiple intelligences, and then I know you've been particularly interested in spiritual intelligence and have written beautifully about it and have delineated many different subcomponents of spiritual intelligence, and you've argued that some subcomponents are more evolved, so to speak, or higher order than others. And I heard in one of your talks, you said that unfortunately, the more lower order ones are the most prevalent ones, and the more higher order ones are the least prevalent. So could you kind of, let's even go zoom in further on spiritual intelligence for a second. Tell me some of the ones you think are some higher than others.
Yeah, well, first of all, I talk about two different types of spiritual intelligence. One involves states of consciousness, and one involves structures or specific stages of consciousness. And the stages is one that goes through the relative overall structures of growing up or development in general. So they'll go from archaic stage to pre-operational stage to concrete operational to formal operational to integral stages of development. And each of those, of course, have a different worldview, a different view of the world. And when it comes to the line of spiritual intelligence as it goes through those stages, they're often referred to in Gene Gebser's terms as archaic stage, magic stage, mythic stage, rational stage, and an integral stage. And those are each very real components. There's a spiritual worldview from each one of those levels, and it does include an understanding of the interwoven nature of all reality and the oneness of all reality. And you can directly experience that oneness in a state of consciousness, not just a structure stage of consciousness. So most structure stages use something like Piaget's cognitive stage.
Right.
And so they are pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational, and so on. And the states of spiritual awareness at the magic stage, you're simply, if you have a spiritual experience of magical, then you become one with the magical world. What you tend to believe is that this oneness with everything that you're aware of is indeed, has a magical quality to it. You feel that you're one with something that's arising because your subject of awareness is one with the mental worldview that's arising. And so to change the objective component of the worldview is actually change your subjective awareness of it as well. And that's what magic means, basically. So if I change my worldview of an object and it goes from magical oneness to a mythic oneness, then the world that's arising does appear to be mythic in nature. And so it might be an actual mythic story or fairy tale or some Greek mythology or something along those lines. And then we have a rational stage of development, and that's a third person awareness. Magic is always first or second person, and mythic is usually second person. And then as we move into formal operational, we move into mathematical capacities and a definite third person awareness. So a him or her or they or them or it or its. And that's becomes a very real reality. And if we change our third person representation, then we'll change the way we relate to those third person objects, to he or him or they or them.
Yeah.
even if I refer to you as he or him or part of us or a part of them relationship, then that is different than if I talk to you by using your first person name, or if I refer to you as a second person. So I'll say, oh, that squadcast is being done by him.
Right.
And not use your name or not refer to you.
Does this, is Martin Buber's work relevant here at all in the I-thou relationship versus it relationships? Martin Buber's sort of delineation of different kinds of relationships and...
Well, an I-thou relationship, as Buber used it, was a very profound spiritual experience.
Yeah.
So it's a direct and immediate experience of being one with an everlasting or transcendental sense of selfhood.
Yeah.
And that was the thou, capital T.
Yeah.
So we have an I-thou relationship with that ultimate reality. And that's a very profound experiential experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so,
we can have it with trees. We can have it with things in nature.
Yeah.
Argued. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just people.
Basically. But it does have a sense that you're actually talking or experiencing a real person, which is why it's an I-thou relationship. And that thou is a very real consciousness. It's a very real awareness. It's a very real experiential reality. And I will experience that thou much as I'm experiencing you as the thou right now. And so that's why Buber selected those terms, because it's just almost like you're talking to God when you have an I-thou experience. And in a certain sense, you are.
Oh boy, we could double click on that. But no, that's it just dawned on me that a lot of what you're saying connects to some of the things that Buber said. How much were you influenced by Abraham Maslow? I'm just curious because he's been a huge influence on my own career and work.
I'm pausing because I've been experienced by so many modern day developmental psychologists. And Abe Maslow was certainly one of them. I think that his system of developmental needs is a fairly good system. If you look in integral psychology, I include charts in the back of that book that refer to over 100 developmental psychologists. And I have charts of all of the stages of development that they've given. And almost all of the structures, the actual ones that have stages that are real structures that can usually be stated as a first person or a second person or a third person structure that they're referring to. Almost all of those go through the same basic levels of development. And that includes Maslow's. So you go from physiological to safety to mythic realities, and then self-actualization, and ultimately a self-transcendence, and then an ultimate unifying stage. And I think those are all fairly real stages, and they do correspond to these major stages that all 100 of these developmental models accurately reflect, but from a different perspective and a different person perspective of development and so on. But those are all very real and very important aspects of our own being. And I've really appreciated that part of the integral framework, the developmental component. And I've gotten a lot of those, or I've gotten almost all of those structure stages from various modern day developmental psychologists. And that includes Abe Maslow. Mm. So he's an important, and because his model is so well known, he was a fairly important influence on me.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And the whole way he discusses the arising of these basic needs of development was also very important for me. And basically, you have to have one stage emerge and be fairly well existing before the next stage will automatically start to emerge.
I would argue that's a misunderstanding of Maslow's work. Do you know that he never drew a pyramid? Not many people know this, but he never actually drew the pyramid that has been so used in textbooks and things. And
yeah,
he really emphasized the being realm versus the deficiency realm. And I think went to great pains to argue that we target multiple needs simultaneously. That life's not like a video game where you have to reach a certain level before you're allowed to get unlock the next level. I wanted to have a discussion with you about if you see any limitations to stage theories of development, because I've been a little critical of stage theories. I have like the sailboat model where I like to think about it as an integrated harmony of pieces as opposed to stages. I actually think that a integrated sailboat model is more in line with integral theory than stage theories. So I'm actually surprised that you embrace stage theories. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah. And it's stage theory versus what?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. What is the alternative? As I view it, so for instance, if I'm thinking of like an operating unit, like a sailboat and various different needs that must be met, they all have to work together as a unifying piece. It doesn't make sense to talk about levels in that kind of situation. It's more about harmony among parts. So I actually just wondering if you see some limitations to stage theories, because I've been a little bit critical that's how we should think about self-actualization as stages.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, what stage theory is talking about in particular that has some merit is when it's talking about the components of a stage, what actually the stage is made of. And sometimes the stage is made of components from a previous stage.
That's right. That's
transcendence. Not get that stage to emerge until that previous state has emerged, like first person, second person, and third person. They do emerge in our awareness in that order. And we don't have a third person without having a second person and a first person. And so that doesn't mean that all developmental sequences have to go through those stages. But to the extent that they do, to the extent that you actually spot a third person stage of mathematical development, there has to be a second person that's part of that third person. And of course, there has to be a first person that's aware of the second person and the third person. And they of course can occur simultaneously, but we have to have a first person before we have a second person. And we have to have a second person before we have a third person.
It's a very good point.
Each of those is made of its previous stage of development.
They're like Russian nesting dolls. No, it's a really important point, but that point is often overlooked in discussions of stage theories. So I'm glad that we're really highlighting this, because it's about transcendence is about including.
Right.
It's not about excluding. I think some
Yeah.
people think of transcendence as, oh, I'm just going to transcend my ego, as though the ego is going to magically be gone. Are you kidding me?
No, that doesn't work at all.
Doesn't work. It doesn't work. Try that. Yeah. It doesn't work. Yeah.
And that's where stage theory does tend to have an important application. I mean, things like mathematics itself has stages of increasing complexity. So you go from arithmetic to algebra with the variable x, and you can then go on to like calculus and so on. And there are different schools, different types of mathematics that develop at more complex stages of awareness. And that's an important aspect as well. That doesn't mean that we have to completely do all of one stage of mathematics before we can be aware of another stage. And once they're sort of all flowing, you can be aware of all of them simultaneously if you want to be. So
Absolutely.
that's not a major issue. But the ways that, like, you're not going to be aware of what a third person consciousness is, what it feels like, if you don't have a first person. And you generally need a second person. That's an understanding that there is not only an I, there's a you, there's a thou.
Yeah.
And then not only that, but we can have a him or a her or a they or a them. And so those are fairly important. And particularly, I mean, that's the way grammar is outlined. And the different forms of I, thou, and him, her are unfolded and outlined. And they're fairly significant. So that's just part of an overall integral approach is when we can include all of those first, second, and third person stages of development in every multiple intelligence that we have.
Wow.
And that's usually, it comes as a bit of a surprise to most people to learn that they do have available general stages of development.
Yeah.
And they started out as a first person kid, just aware of their own awareness. And then they became aware of their mother, their father, siblings, or some second person that they were directly talking to, and a stream of exchange where they would take the other person's perspective and then they would go back to their own perspective and so on. And then they would understand that there's a third person perspective, that I don't have to be talking to you in order for you to exist, because you can just be that person over there, that third person, him or her, it or they or them. And so, but when people realize that they have first person, like Maslow's stages of development is one example, or Jane Lovinger's or Robert Keegan's, they're often surprised to find that those stages have been named and that they can recognize them if they look within, generally speaking. So that becomes very interesting. And as I say, it's a novel experience for most people. If they read Jane Lovinger's stages of ego development, for example, and they'll see it going from very interior, infantile, just first person stages of development to a full you development, to a they or them development. They're interested to find that they have those stages in themselves that are arising. And I think it's a very interesting component of integral theory overall. And so I spend a fair amount of time when I talk about the magic stage or the mythic stage or the rational stage, the formal operational stage, or the integrative stage of development.
Mm. Yeah.
And a lot of people are very interested in finding that out.
Yeah. You're obviously a legend when it comes to integrating stage theories. I mean, it's the amount of work and thought you've put into it is hard to surpass. But I do want to get your thinking about something and let this be a conversation between us. You know, there's different forms of transcendence. There's vertical and horizontal forms.
Right.
I've been trying to emphasize in my own research horizontal, like what Maslow called synergy, which is a concept he took from, the anthropologist, I believe, Ruth Benedict, the idea of synergy, that what's automatically good for me is automatically good for the world. So there's it's a huge integration between self and world, as opposed to a vertical form of transcendence where you can fall prey to, I think, spiritual narcissism and this, what psychologists call the I'm enlightened and you're not effect. Where you take some sort of meditation retreat and you think that you're more enlightened than everyone else and you're better than everyone else, So I just want to get your thoughts on vertical versus horizontal transcendence.
What did you call it?
So horizontal versus vertical transcendence. Right. It seems like your work focuses a lot on vertical. Am I wrong? Because am I wrong about that? Yeah.
Well, it does spend a great deal of time outlining the vertical stages.
Yeah.
But I recognize horizontal development as well.
How can one who reaches one of these some of the highest stages possible, still maintain a real sense of modesty and a lack of narcissism, where they don't think they're somehow better than their fellow humans, even though they have a different sort of way of being in this world?
Well, first of all, a person has to know some developmental model to even be aware that if they're on a higher stage, they're actually on a higher stage. Because most people don't feel these stages. They don't feel, I'm at a really low stage of interpersonal development right now. True. Oh, wait, I just moved up to concrete operational. That's fantastic. I still have a ways to go, but I'm much higher than I used to be. People don't track that. And they certainly don't know when they're at the highest stage of a particular stage model. Like Lovinger called her highest stage the integral or integrated stage of development. And this came right after an autonomous stage, which came after a formal, operational, authentic stage. And that came after a conformist stage. But when you're at a conformist stage, you don't know you're at a conformist stage. So you're not going to feel that much greater when you go post-conventional. So you have to have some sense that you're moving through these stages. And then you don't generally feel superior. That's not the nature of the experience that most people have at different stages of development. It's not, I'm 2/3 of the way up, I'm better than 2/3 of those people out there are. That just doesn't cross your mind. It doesn't come up as an experiential reality that, now I'm at a higher stage than somebody else is.
I see.
You can think that you're at a higher stage, but you won't necessarily at the same time think higher than that person or higher than those people who aren't at this high stage. That just doesn't come with your awareness that, okay, wait a minute, now I'm on Maslow's self-transcendent stage, or I'm on his self-authentic stage. It just doesn't come in that type of experience.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are many examples, though, of spiritual narcissism, as I'm sure you would agree. Of gurus who think that they are more enlightened and they use that as justification for exploitation, right?
Usually, narcissism goes down with development.
You would hope. Yeah.
So, slowly, but it does. The higher the stage of development, the less narcissistic it is. And that's just pretty much all stage models agree with that empirical finding. Now, it is possible that that you go through different lines of development at different types, at different stages. So somebody can have, it's at least theoretically possible, that they could have a spiritual intelligence experience and tag it to their own narcissism.
Right.
I mean, that's completely possible. But it doesn't occur as a typical condition. So when you have, like, if you're practicing Zen Buddhism and you have your first Satori, you'll feel fantastic. You feel one with everything. And it's a great, great feeling. But you won't tend to think, oh, I've had a Satori and nobody else here has, or all those people over there haven't had the Satori. It's just not part of the Satori experience. That's not how and why and what you experience. When you experience a Satori, it's discovering your own true Buddha nature, your own true self. And that feels fantastic, obviously. But you don't therefore tend to look down on people who haven't had Satoris. I mean, you can. There's nothing preventing you. But it's not described as a typical experience of a Satori. That's not how Satori is defined or described.
But can it make you more prone to think that you know what's best for others, and that, like, you can dictate to people how they should live their lives? Can't you fall prey, because we're all human? Sure. Can't some people fall prey to that, where they kind of think, well, they know what they see great, they think they see great clarity into the real way? Yeah.
Well, that can particularly arise when they can think better than the average or most people. And they're genuinely reaching some higher aspect of their own awareness. Maybe they understand advanced mathematics, and not very many people do. And if they think about that, they would have the thought, well, I'm more advanced than most people. Yeah. And that would be true if they really were at an advanced stage of mathematical development, for example. But again, it's not my understanding nor my experience of people that do reach great heights of mathematical understanding, that they're always thinking, wow, I've got this great mathematical brain and most nobody else can match it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, that's more likely to occur in the earlier stages of development. The developmentalists actually call narcissistic stage or an ego power stage. And people there often think that they're better than a lot of other people. because that's the nature of that stage. It thinks only that its own ideas are true and important. And that's because it really can't take another person's perspective. So you can have like a 6-year-old who thinks that they're the world's greatest. And they're particularly at a stage of development that Lovinger called narcissistic or egoic power. And that's exactly what they're experiencing. Their own ego has an enormous amount of power. And they think that way. And so they will sometimes make that comparison with I have more power than you do.
Yeah. But can't like stages wax and wane throughout the course of even one's day? Yeah, I mean, you talk about stages though. It's like you've reached a stage and then you're there and you don't revert back to the old one, right? I mean, isn't it possible? This is why I have some criticism of stage way of thinking about it, because throughout the course of a day, you can have a profoundly narcissistic moment, and then the next moment you could think at a higher level, right? Is that right? Like it can change.
Oh.
You know, don't you have your narcissistic moments, or are you completely over it?
No, sure.
We all do. Yeah.
And that's, again, that's not what developmental theory is generally saying. It acknowledges, as Maslow does, that these needs can arise multiply. They can arise together. They can arise alongside of each other. But there does tend to be a general shift in your center of awareness, your center of gravity, from a lower stage to a higher stage. And if that higher stage does include, as an actual component of its own self-being, that actually includes a previous stage, then that previous stage has to be there in some sense for the higher stage to include it.
Yeah.
And so
I hear what you're saying.
Fairly common. Just like we have to have first person awareness and first person words, I, me, mine, before we can be aware of another person, you, thou, and so on.
I like that. I like the way you just framed that in terms of different kinds of awareness.
Right.
I'm getting triggered over the word stage for some reason. Maybe that's something I need to get over. Maybe I need to get to a higher stage to get over it. That framework way of thinking. But I like the awareness aspect a lot. Yeah.
And I think stages can be very misused.
Correct.
And that's something any sane person who's beyond 7 years old would tend to be able to be aware of that and to agree with that. But stage theories are particularly bad when they refer to themselves as stages.
Yeah.
And they do understand that there's a higher stage.
Yeah.
And so somebody like an Adolf Hitler is going to be proud and glad to say that, yeah, he's at the highest stage of development.
That's right.
And that's not a good sign.
No.
It's actually a sign that you're at one of the earliest stages of narcissistic development.
Absolutely. I mean, Hitler was not an integral, he wasn't a very integral human being. Let's be honest. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, I really like your distinction between waking up and growing up. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about where your thinking is these days on that? Yeah.
I sort of came upon that distinction when I started studying developmental psychology. And it was in my early teenage years. And I was at that time a profound and intense practitioner of Zen Buddhism. So I would meditate daily and all sorts of things like that.
Mm.
And I had an actual Zen teacher and so on. And as I started to, and I knew that Zen had a sort of developmental perspective in what was called the 10 ox herding pictures, which showed 10 broad overall developmental stages of Zen awareness. And so it goes through these different pictorial representations called the ox herding pictures, where the ox means our big mind, our true mind, and how we first are not aware of it at all. So it just looks like an ordinary world out there. And then we start to become aware of higher states or stages, even to the point that we get to the 8th stage, which just shows an empty circle. And when you sit in meditation and you meditate, that's what comes up. Absolutely nothing. There's a vast, formless emptiness to awareness. And that's your 8th Zen ox herding picture, because it really does feel like a vast, formless emptiness and nothing arising. And then you get to the 10th Zen ox herding picture, and it's essentially the same as the first ox herding picture, except you've gone through all of these previous stages. And so I always had those stages of development in mind. And when I started actually studying developmental psychology, I naturally would sort of compare their stages that they presented, and all of them presented 6, 7, 8, 9 or so stages of development. And none of them lined up directly with the 10 ox herding pictures. There was some sort of different something going on, and I couldn't figure it out. And what I was looking at, of course, was Zen was talking about stages in a waking up process, a process of enlightenment, which is where you come to realize that your real self is not this little self that you think exists behind and between your eyes, someplace in your head looking out at the world, and is separate from everything it sees and is above all of it. It doesn't talk about the stages that awareness goes through. It talks about going from that awareness to a vast emptiness to an ultimate unity or oneness with everything. And that's a waking up experience. And as you experience some of those like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th stages of the Zen ox herding pictures, you'll often feel like you're actually waking up. And that feels just like you've been asleep. And then when you first open your eyes and the world comes in, that's a waking up. And that's what a Zen Satori feels like. It feels like, wow, I've been asleep in this waking world for a long period of time. And now I'm actually aware of reality. And I happen to be one with that reality.
Let me just take a pause there and link that waking up, that let's call it unitive consciousness, that unitive consciousness. What is the role of more analytical IQ type intelligences for that? Is it, or someone, I'm returning to my older question about general intelligence. People have argued that that IQ measures general intelligence, but to me, it seems like it's not that relevant. It seems like there's plenty of people with sky high IQ scores who do not have unitive consciousness. So I'd love for you to talk to me about this.
Yeah. There seems to be, first of all, we would say that general intelligence, general IQ intelligence, really corresponds to a few of our lines of multiple intelligence. And it can just be called that, our general intelligence stage of development. And that seems to be a certain minimal achievement in that IQ stream does seem a very helpful and in some sense necessary stage of development for a satori or a waking up experience. Now, you don't have to go off the scale in your IQ. You don't have to be at 140 or 160 to have a satori. You do have to be at least have some degree of adult growing up.
Reasoning ability. Yeah.
Yeah. So there has to be, like, you have to have at least a concrete operational capacity in awareness. And then if you have a satori, it's generally a formal operational state that you're coming from. Mm-hmm. But all that's absolutely necessary is to get through concrete operational thinking. And then you can open to a type of satori. And the satori, of course, can itself be fairly small, or maybe you go from first person of the 10 Zen Oxford pictures to the third person when you have your first satori. But that can still feel like a genuine awakening, that you're seeing stuff that you'd never seen before. And that includes some degree of your headless condition of realizing, I don't have a head. My head is one with everything that it's looking at.
Do people with intellectual disabilities, are they capable of enlightenment at all?
People with
intellectual disabilities?
Well, if it's severe disabilities, the answer is not generally, no. But if it's a minor problem or
it's so interesting,
minor deficiency, they can have some sort of experiential awakening.
What is it about? This is so interesting because I'm very interested in neurodiversity, and so I've studied and researched the link between like the schizophrenia spectrum and creativity, for instance. So
what?
The schizophrenia spectrum, it's a spectrum, those who aren't hospitalized but score high in psychotic-like traits. There's a certain like inverted U-shaped curve. So like there's a maximum point where it's maximally conducive to creativity, and then you fall off the cliff and end up in the mental institution if you have too much. But there is a certain point where it's good to have schizotypal like traits. And I'm just wondering, what do you make of that correlation between schizotypy and experiences of self-transcendence? And
I can't understand what word you're using.
Oh, sorry, psychosis. Okay, have you heard the phrase schizotypy?
Schizotypy.
It's like schizotypal. It's like the personality dimension of schizophrenia. So all of us, So being being prone to magical thinking, being prone to unusual ways of thinking, sometimes it can cause an affect difference. These are not things that we would want to psychopathologize, right? These aren't things we want to stick a DSM on. We just say people differ in these traits naturally occurring in the general population. What do you make about these findings that those who score higher on these questionnaires, these schizotypal questionnaires, do tend to score higher in openness to experience and self-transcendent experiences, and maybe even experiences of enlightenment?
From what I understand of your experience, you're talking about some experiences that could be viewed as very positive, being a part of a schizophrenic personality.
Well, we talked about how IQ might relate to some of this, but personality seems to relate to some of this. So I'm trying to think through what are the personality characteristics that kind of predispose you in some way to higher stages of thinking in your model. Yeah.
And then you gave some examples?
Yeah, from my own research. Yeah, I gave an example of openness to experience and schizotypy, for instance. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what?
Schizotypy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are a whole fairly small but not insignificant number of predisposing factors that can lead one to actually help one to have a Satori experience. And that certainly includes openness.
Seems to be a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the same way that there are a certain number of factors that can prevent one from having a Satori. And we talked about to have at least a certain degree of cognitive intelligence, but you don't have to be anywhere near a genius.
That's good news. It's good news for everyone. A lot of geniuses don't, or intellectual geniuses have not even experienced some of this. So that seems to be really important. Yeah, I'm super interested in individual differences. That's a large thread of my research. So just trying to connect the individual differences work to stage development, because I think that's a super interesting link.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are important connections. Those are important traits to track and understand and follow. And I think that's why a few developmental models have people get to certain stages of development and they'll seem to have expansive or opening or unitive experiences. Not everybody, but a large number, larger than at the previous stage or stages of development. And so I think that's very interesting. And they generally all tend to occur when that particular developmental model is tracing stages that are about 2/3 of the way as high as they can go. And that just seems to be just a generalized characteristic that you'll notice in a lot of the developmental models. And that's always been a very interesting experience to me, because very few models that I'm aware of, Maslow actually track the experience of Satori. They don't say, oh, well, let's look for what stage people start to have Satori. But that's what you do tend to see in some vague, undefined way. So that's always been interesting to me. And it's about 2/3 of the way through their stages that they present.
Could integral theory be falsified scientifically? Like, in what ways has it been tested? Because there's so many components to it. It's a lot to,
Yeah. It depends upon whether you're talking about stages themselves, because I think those are constantly being scientifically checked and validated. Because almost every developmentalist, once they discover their own model with its own stages, get empirical evidence from their subjects that they're studying. And so they're always checking and scientifically testing for the stage of development. And so since I'm simply referring to the subtotal of all of those stage models, that a particular stage is not going to be generally disproven. But how those models actually fit together, that's something that is open to discussion and dispute. So my claim that I give 100 stage models and that they're all going through the same similar levels of development, that could certainly be discussed and dismissed. It would be a little bit hard because I include so many different models. But when at the beginning, when I'm putting together 3 or 4 or 5, each way that I would put them together could be disputed and checked. And it might be that they just appear to be going through similar stages of development, but they're actually not when you look at the real evidence at each stage. But I think because I have myself such a high respect for the scientific method and scientific models of reality, I don't want to present some idea that doesn't have a lot of evidence supporting it.
Awesome.
And so that's why if you want to go through my claims in integral psychology, you're going to have to look at 100 developmental models and take evidence from each of them that's wrong. But that's the whole point. A model got to be included in that 100 models because it supported the general idea that I was presenting.
Yeah, I wish there was more research in psychology or interest in modern day psychology on development stages and higher forms of development. It was bigger in the humanistic psychology era than this era, I think. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I wish there was too. And I don't really understand why there isn't.
Yeah, it's, there's been, me neither. I mean, I'm interested in it. So I'm like, why isn't more people interested in it? I know. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer. Yeah.
Evidence that we do have from well-respected and well-accepted models of development. Those are looked upon with a fair amount of acceptance. And they're sort of happy with what they're showing. So even when Maslow would introduce his needs, even though there was and continues to be some disagreement about which level there is and what the actually ingredients or the nature of that level is, and that's completely, I agree with all of the questioning about that aspect of stages.
Right.
But he had demonstrated so much importance to those general ideas that he presented that he did have a profound impact on psychology. I mean, he founded 2 of the 4 forces. He founded humanistic psychology, and he went on to help discover transpersonal psychology.
Yeah.
And those were pretty major.
Well, I agree, but I would say neither of them are considered part of mainstream psychology in modern day. If you compare it to the amount of conferences and work being done, like cognitive science, for instance, it pales in comparison. So, but for sure, I mean, that was my attempt to write my book Transcend was to bring back Maslow and the science of humanism, humanistic psychology, and transcendence. So I'm with you. Can we talk about the societal level for a second and some of your thoughts about this? Because in some of the work I've read, you seem to suggest that we are progressing to higher levels of society, but I can say that doesn't appear to be the case. It seems like society right now is the opposite of especially American society. Everything is so polarized on every issue. Isn't that the exact opposite of the spirit of integral theory?
Right. Yeah, I'm not thrilled with the direction.
I'm glad you said that.
Is a whole seems to be headed.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
Developing in a regressive fashion. And I'm just not that thrilled with the type of civil culture that we have and the it does seem to be itself highly polarized.
Yeah.
And to left hand, progressive approaches, and right hand, traditional conservative approaches. And they both tend to be presented in extreme ways.
Yeah.
As if the only members of both of those parties are extremists.
I know.
And it's just really disappointing in general.
So this is what America needs: integral theory now more than ever.
And I'm not proud of what we call society right now.
Yeah, me neither. Me neither, brother.
I don't know why. It does seem to be, well, in some ways, and I have to be very careful with what I'm saying now, but in some ways, some aspects of our social engagement seems to have actually regressed a bit. Certainly, when we hit the 60s, there was a fair amount of increase in our interest in spiritual experience. So there were things like Kerouac and Dharma bums and Zen Buddhism and Satori experiences. And in large measure, that was probably because of the psychedelic influx that began in the late 50s and throughout the 60s. And people would have psychedelic unity experiences.
Yes.
And that's what Kerouac was writing about. And that's what a lot of human potential organizations were talking about. And they weren't necessarily recommending psychedelics, but they were talking about the psychedelic sort of unity experience. And that sort of had an impact on our society at large. And so we sort of went through a Zen period in our social awareness. And those seem to die down along with the psychedelic experience. And we seem to lose interest in both of those at about the same time. And I'm not sure why, except it could be causal. It could be that psychedelics induce Satori-like experiences. And as long as psychedelics are sort of a crass hit in our culture, then a psychedelic type Satori experience is going to be fairly common and talked about and referred to. But as we just sort of got over psychedelics, we also got over the Zen Satori.
But there seems to be a renaissance in scientific understanding of the benefits of psychedelics. Don't you see a new renaissance of psychedelic interest right now?
Not a huge amount.
Really? Like Michael Pollan's documentary and book, and it seems to have brought a lot of interest, and Roland Griffith's research.
Well, that's true. Well, that research is there, and so that's important. And I'm glad they've done it. That's really important. But I'm just not sure how much awareness the average public has of that type of experience or research. I don't see a great deal of it myself.
There does seem to be
happy to be wrong about that.
Yeah, I don't know the precise. I don't know where we're really at. I just know that maybe it could be the certain circles I swim in, as opposed to society at large. It could just be that all I hear about is psychedelics and in my field right now. But don't you think there's a great paradox that we're so focused on diversity, and yet we couldn't be more polarized? I mean, can we just be honest for a second?
I know. And I think it's because there is that very real diversity going on, that is what infects our social awareness. And so we're not really specifically aware of the actual research on diversity of multiple intelligences and ideas and so on. But we do come from a diverse perspective.
Well, we're focusing on racial and gender diversity and not things that are more skin deep, like perceptual diversity, neurodiversity, biodiversity. Yeah.
Right. Well, and one of the reasons seems to be that when we talk about diversity, it largely is either a racial diversity or a gender diversity. And these are the things that we immediately see that are different between people. We see if a person's black or white. We see if they're a boy or a girl.
Right.
And so even without recognizing it, when we talk about diversity, we're really reducing human beings to their simplest perceptual differences.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, but it's controversial to say that to some people.
Well, yeah, I suppose it is.
But I agree. I mean, I think that if people really truly understood your writings, and it came from, which, by the way, I've read a lot of your writings, so I really have deep respect. And this whole conversation today, I hope you feel it comes from a place of deep respect.
Sure.
It just seems to me, you're welcome. It seems to me like if people really understood what you were trying to say, and we had a society that revolved around it, we would all come from a spirit of, I may disagree with you, but maybe there's some truth to what you're saying that I can incorporate into my truth. But no one thinks like that these days.
That's right. And so we're not very diverse in our actual viewpoints.
No.
And yet, even to talk about that is not allowable.
No.
Generally, it's not a recognized good thing.
No. It's because it's either or thinking, right? It's like, not like, oh, we can absolutely have racial diversity, we can absolutely have gender diversity, and we can have viewpoint diversity. I mean, we can have all these, like, why? But yeah, people think of it as you either can pick one piece of the pie or the other. That's so antithetical to integral thinking. Right. So antithetical. In the couple minutes we have left, can I ask you some reader questions from or Twitter questions? What are the ways in which you think research psychology could improve and is off track? We talked a little bit about that earlier. I don't know if you have anything further to say about that.
Improve?
The way modern day research psychology could improve and is off track.
Right. Well, again, you mentioned that the field you were involved with was full of psychedelic awareness. But other than those sort of one or two references you gave, I'm not aware of a great deal of research on the psychedelic experience. Now, I know some fundamental research has been done. I think even a team at Princeton
and in London,
on psychedelics tended to have psychedelic unifying experiences. And that got a fair amount of wide acceptance. But I haven't seen a series of specific testing in a large degree of the type of psychedelic experiences or alternate experiential awareness that's able to be generated from different types of drugs.
Well, I'll send
'Cause
you my podcast chat with Roland Griffiths, because there's some really exciting work coming out on that right now.
That's great to hear. Well, that's one thing I would like to see from psychology. And so who did you say your conversation was with?
Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that's terrific.
Yeah. They're really leading the way. They're really leading the way in understanding
that's
this.
great.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I think I don't really understand why developmental research has dropped off as much as it has.
Yeah, good point.
So I would like to see some response to that situation. Like in terms of the introduction of new developmental models, or developmental models with a new set of data or a new set of experiential understanding, I'm really only aware of one or two major new introductions to developmental theory that have been offered recently. And that includes some of the work done by Jane Lovinger when she produced her 8 or 9 stages of development. She came up with a written test, sometimes just to fill in, my mother is fill in the blank, or I am fill in the blank. But she would get responses that clearly fell into about 8 or 9 different classes. And those classes tended to come one after the other in the stage-like fashion. But her developmental model and its test is now the most widely used psychological test worldwide. So that's great. But she developed that some 15, 20 years.
Yeah, even longer than that, even as well. Yeah.
And then Robert Keegan from Harvard has produced his 5 broad conceptual realms of broad states of consciousness. And that's relatively new, but it's also a relatively simple 5 stages. But I like Keegan, and I like his work, and I know him because he's particularly connected with my work, and so we've had a lot of discussions about that.
That's amazing. Yeah, no, he's awesome. Well, okay. Do you think life is just a test run?
Well, in a certain sense, depending upon what you think your overall states of consciousness map is like, and the idea that when we die, we all go to some higher state of whatever variety it is. If that's true, then the stages of waking life that we go through would just be a sort of test run for the final afterlife great advance in awareness that we're going to experience or go through. Well, I don't know that that's true. There is in my theoretical model. And I would expect that if we went on in some way, we would be, in effect, growing upon what had come before. Makes a certain amount of sense. And then apparently when we're reborn, we ditch all of that and go back to stage 1. But someplace in our awareness is an understanding of what we have to do to get to stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4. Because there's no doubt that human beings grow and develop, and we can spot certain broad stages to that growth and development. So it appears to be very real. And then when developmental psychologists started in the 40s and 50s actually measuring this amount of growth and development, and they would notice these seemingly stage-like aspects to it, then we got all these models of development. And there were, as I say today, there are like 100 different developmental models in existence. And there are at least some 15 to 20 that are fairly well known. And if you take a class in developmental psychology, you'll get exposed to about a dozen different developmental maps of awareness. And they're presented with a great deal of authority. Like, these are really real.
I know.
And they really exist. And here's the experimental data that measures each stage of development. So we have real experiential evidence or scientific data on this stuff. So that's all fine. And how that, so the fact that likely, if consciousness goes on in any degree in an afterlife, I have no doubt that development will continue.
Right.
Because that's what consciousness does. We learn from our mistakes and from our successes. A lot of what we do now is based on what we did yesterday.
Right.
And so that can, I mean, if there is an afterlife, I'm sure it'll be a developmental concern. And we can spot growing up in our degrees of Christ consciousness or whatever the hell we're actually introduced to.
Whatever the hell. Hopefully it's not hell that we end up in.
Continue in some way.
Yeah. Whew, I know that was a deep question. Let's go a little bit lighter. I haven't heard his takes on the social media landscape, platform culture, big data, big tech, etc. I'd love to hear his prognosis in that regard. How would an integral social media be like?
Well, I think one of the first and interesting things that would happen as a large number of people started to discuss like the developmental component of our awareness, that they would, of course, look at all the various models that were available and discuss their pluses and minuses. But I think one of the most interesting things they would get into is how can we personally increase our stage of development? And what can we do to talk about it or help in that fashion? Or does that help at all? Just talking about it. But I'm sure that would be an area that we would look into, because it would be a bunch of people, a bunch of second person views brought together into a large third person social environment. And they would naturally be talking about all these things. And so it would be very curious to see what developmental capacities emerged from that.
It would. I mean, just social media seems so set up to polarize us as much as possible.
Right. Yeah. Mostly what you get on social media today, first of all, isn't social. It's very nasty spirited and very aggressive and very anti this and anti that. I mean, it's very easy to get a certain type of argumentative spirit going.
Yeah.
That's not terrific. And when you do look at any of the positive things that are happening, they're happening to a very small degree and in a very small percentage of the overall population of social environmental situation. And I'm not sure why the degree or level of our conscious discussion isn't higher than it appears to be, because it doesn't appear to be that high. And I don't know what your experience of social media is like.
Very low levels of stage of development there.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Whew.
No reason why it's so low jumps in mind.
There's no reason.
It's not obvious.
No, my colleague Courtney Bigany is trying to spearhead a whole new field, positive product design, positive uses of social media and stuff. But there's something in humans that really gets excited by the muck, the controversy, there's something more exciting about that in a way than I mean, I'm not saying to me and you because we're at such a high level. No, I'm joking, but but I'm saying I think there's something in humans that really entertainment. There's a lot of entertainment value.
Yeah, I think that's probably close to the specific. And God bless our spirit, but it does seem to be rather unremarkable.
Okay, here, this is a whopper doozy question. Please take this with don't get mad at me for asking it. Some readers have characterized your work as both a new age pastiche for smart people and idealist religious apologetics, including gussied up creation science and claims of transcendent divinity. How, holy shit, how have you thought about and addressed these critiques over time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can just start with the whole creation issue. One thing is certain about evolution, and that is that Darwin does not cover all of the issue. There's a what to evolution, and there's a how to evolution, and there's a why to evolution. And Darwin got started pretty good on the how of evolution.
Not the why.
But as to the why, that natural selection in spontaneous mutation is just not going to cut it. It is so inadequate. I mean, some of the calculations have been done showing that the overall number of mutations that would be required in order to produce not only just a living being, but a horse or a deer or a human being, it would take like, it's somewhere over 3 volumes of 500 pages each.
Interesting.
In a set of Encyclopedia Britannica, so 3 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica, to even get close to the amount. I mean, it's something like 1 to the 10, 40 zeros. It's some huge, staggering amount like that. And so they're clearly, and most evolutionary biologists now seem to acknowledge this. You'll see a lot of YouTube presentations on why evolution is occurring and what is forcing that dramatic increase in the diversity of options. And I happen to agree with that. And so sometimes that I'm tagged with creation science or something along that line. And all that it's doing is pointing out that there has to be some sort of drive or force or desire or something that's driving this why of evolution. Because to go from a simple bacteria to a deer, it just takes an enormous amount of mutations and the natural selection, which is supposed to be the selective force, but that's just natural selection is just talking about whether an organism manages to pass on its DNA. And the claim is that, well, the stronger, the fitter, the better evolved, the more likely that it'll carry on. But that doesn't say much. That's not telling us very much.
Survival of the fittest. Yeah, the survival of the fittest myth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I feel like we should table that directionality of evolution, as well as the universe, because I have great conversations with some of my scientist friends about there does seem to be some sort of directionality of the universe, and that's fascinating. I mean, holy cow, there's so much we don't know. Look, I'm having this chat with you right now, and I'm finding you to be quite open-minded, modest. I think there might be some misconceptions about you, because someone else asked this. They said, some people have said you have an inability to deal with criticism. What do you think of that criticism? They try to catch you in a catch-22 there.
Well, to hell with that. That's all I think. I don't think so. I think because I've written on so many topics, and there's a great deal of general critique. I accept most of it. But when I see a clear misrepresentation or what I consider a clear mistake, I'll try to point it out, just because I'm trying to move the conversation in an adequate direction. Not because I'm trying to prove Ken Wilber is this or Ken Wilber is that. But I get that criticism as well.
Yeah.
Oh, he's hypersensitive, and because he's got it all.
You're not presenting yourself as that today. I can say.
Well, I hope not.
You're not.
But I understand why some people would think that. If nothing else, I've just written so much.
Yeah.
I mean, some 30 odd books and they've been widely translated.
That's an understatement. Hold on. That's an understatement. You've written a lot. You've written a lot. I don't know how many people have written more words that have been published than you. Let's be honest. Holy shit. A couple more short questions and then I'll set you free. This has been a real stimulating conversation for me. And this one's, I'm super interested your thoughts about this. Does an objective reality exist, or is it all superpositions? Because you do focus a lot on superpositions. You do focus a lot on there being a grain of truth to all kind of perspectives. What do you think about objective truth?
Well, I think there is such a thing as an objective world. But I do happen to believe that objective world itself has authentic subjective features. That the four quadrants, in other words, exist everywhere. And that we have an upper left and an upper right and a lower left and a lower right at all levels of evolution, including simple bacteria. I think they come with an individual subjective awareness, and they're aware of an actual objective something or other, and they come together and form collectives in the lower quadrants, and those collectives have an interior consciousness and an exterior awareness. So there is subject and object, and intersubjective and interobjective, all the way up and all the way down. And I believe that. And so I don't have any trouble and there are, of course, various forces operating in all of them. So I don't have any trouble when I watch all of these evolutionary programs on YouTube and they're talking about the extraordinary mutational rate and natural selection of these hundreds of thousands of mutation selected processes. And they are all describing something that happens in an objective world. And I believe that objective world is real. I don't believe it exists apart from subjective reality. As I say, subjective realities go all the way down. And that's true in the creation of the universe and the creation of life in that universe. So I don't have any trouble watching those kind of YouTube presentations. It makes sense to me. So there's a real objective world. But then how each subjective creature interprets that world varies.
Yeah.
And that's true for human beings. The way you and I are interpreting this conversation has significant, important differences.
Yeah.
And the incredible thing about human perspectives is we can talk about those differences in the way we see things. So we have a perception of our perceptual differences. And that's great. But all of those are available to us in these quadrants that are subjective and objective and intersubjective and interobjective. And all of those realities are very real.
Look, this is so important because you're basically saying that, look, none of us has the whole truth. And we need each other, and we need, there's ultimately a great modesty there, isn't there? You know?
Well, I suppose so, but it's definitely true that the first part that you say, I mean, we really do need each other.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point of science, is you have to reproduce what you claim is the truth. If it's true, do it again. Let's see. And thank God we've got a whole lot of people that are doing that. So we're getting vaccines for different sorts of diseases, and we're moving towards cures for cancer. And all of those are because we're dealing with some of these very real realities. And we can test our approaches to them, and we can create things that will alter any of those quadrants, any of those forms of awareness. Those are all real issues.
Don't you agree that it requires a large amount of humility to commit the search for truth, knowing that you'll never know the full
Also, in its own strange way, it's a very attractive feature. When you meet somebody that has a large amount of humility, you're generally attracted to their humility. I mean, it's a very beautiful thing, really.
Great way to pick up chicks. I'm joking. Artificial intelligence, do you think we'll get to a point where they will have different levels of consciousness? Like, we'll be like, that computer's at stage 2. That computer's at stage 4. Yeah. Green, that computer's at green level.
I don't see that there would be any problem. I mean, what a lot of programmers are doing now is they just sort of leave the computer alone and start tracking its own life and start making up its own programming to do different things. And the researchers can just watch this happen. They don't step in and tell the computer what to do.
Right.
So it's paying attention. These computers that we're discussing are paying attention to their past.
Mm.
And because of that, they're altering their present.
Mm.
And that's a sense of growth. That's a type of growth.
Yeah.
And depending on whether we're going to start tracking the degree of complexity that each computer brings to the present situation, and we see those complexities grow, and we follow the ways that they grow and find that there are certain similarities in them, then that would start to indicate a certain type of stage-like development of this very complex computer awareness. And that wouldn't surprise me if something like that started to happen. I don't know. I mean, other than the fact that we do have computers that, in the sense, grow and develop their own programming and create those kinds of stages, if you will, that's already been demonstrated. I mean, these computers do create their own programming and go through it, and they can be more complex and go through that. Nobody's gotten onto a stage conception of what these computers are doing.
That's why I asked you. Yeah.
In large measure, that's because psychology itself continues to sort of ignore the issue. And we've talked about why this is, and the answer is, I don't know. I'm very disappointed in it, and very happy to see when somebody like Keegan or Lovinger comes out with another model of what's going on. I'm not sure. That's just, as we talked about, maybe psychedelics are everywhere you look, but stages of psychedelic growth and development are not everywhere. So that still tends to be not totally ignored, but it's not a great rush of research and awareness on that type of reality.
Well, I agree. And I'm just so curious the future when we integrate mind with machine when we meld all these things together and we try to upload our consciousness to eternity, and we're taking psychedelics while we're in that state of consciousness. Oh my gosh, it'll be.
If there was a real online, we were talking about what would they work on. That question would clearly be one of the central issues that I think would draw a lot of people to.
I agree. I'll ask you one last question today. I find it fascinating, by the way, your early life, and you were a prodigy in school, I believe. And I've studied prodigies. I mean, that's something that's part of my research. So I'm interested in that. Where do you see and I also want to acknowledge, you've gone through a lot of suffering in your life. I mean, you've had some really significant losses, and you've grown from them. And you have a movie, about the loss of your wife, and it was like if someone doesn't cry in that by watching that movie, they're not human in my view. So you've had such a remarkable life so far. I mean, not over yet. You've had a remarkable life so far. This is my question. Where do you see your consciousness as it is right now? How would you classify it right now? And then is there any room for growth anymore? This is my final question for you. Is there anywhere for your consciousness? Can you still do better?
Right. Well, I can definitely do better in the degree of waking up. Now, I find this sort of curious because I've been studying and practicing various types of waking up, particularly Zen Buddhism, since I was 17, 18 years old.
I know.
And I've had several Satori experiences and have gotten transmitted, but I still don't feel that I'm at the top of the heap.
Wow.
There doesn't seem to be that feeling in a waking up. Like when you first wake up, you're aware, oh, I've gone from being asleep to I'm really waking now.
Yes.
And you can be, you're aware of that transition, but you don't walk around for days afterwards thinking, wow, I'm at the top of this pile of levels of development. I'm right up and it feels good. It doesn't appear to you that way. You can't really feel stages of growth and development, although you can sort of feel your expansion when you move to a higher state. But you never get to a point where you say, I'm there. I've arrived.
Good.
And
That's good.
I don't even know any awakened Zen masters that feel that. And I've talked to several of them, and I know several of them are personal friends. And I've never gotten that sense. And when I've talked with them about it, they've all denied that anything like that goes on. And I think that's true. So all I can say is I'm quite advanced in waking up certain experiential aspects of that. And I don't mind saying that. It doesn't feel non-humble or something.
I know.
But I'm not claiming that I'm totally enlightened or anything like that. And again, I don't know anybody who does. But, and on the growing up scale, I'm somewhere in third tier. And I had gone through Lovinger's first tier and second tier of development by the time I was a teenager. And so that's just based on tests that I have taken.
Yeah.
And so are there any stages higher in Lovinger scale? Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's also something that almost anybody that you talk to who seems fairly developed, if you ask them, do you feel you yourself are as far up as you can go up? And I don't know very many people that have that experience, even if they are really highly developed. I just don't hear many of them saying, oh, yeah, I'm at the top of the scale. You can't get me higher than where I'm at. Because they know it's not true. They know if they look within that they can still go higher. So I think that outside of the handful of models that have actual tests for their stages of growing up, and there are at least a dozen very good tests, from the Piaget's test, the Lovinger's test, the Keegan, so on. And you can measure where you are in that growing up scale. And to the extent that they have a highest scale, like Lovinger has a turquoise second tier, fully integrated stage of development, you can measure that. But notice that the percentage of the people in the population that are at Jane Lovinger's highest stage is 0.5%. That's not a lot of people.
No, it's not.
Stage.
Wow. So, did you actually take some of these tests when you were a teenager?
Sure.
Wow. Well, no, you said sure, and most teenagers are not. Well, but by the way, I love taking these kinds of tests when I was a teenager too. So I
guess I've gotten so much into developmental studies that I would look up if they had any tests and liberally.
I took all these IQ tests as a teenager and only saved the ones that made me look good.
Right. But 0.5% of the population is not great. Whereas the percentage of the population at green, which is the highest, the first tier, and is the basis of most postmodern approaches, that's about 25, 26, 27% of the population.
Yeah, you argue.
Scale.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that she's actually measured the general population. That's what she finds. So that does a lot to show us why postmodern, multicultural, pluralistic, relativistic approaches are so common, but truly integrative approaches are not very. 0.5% is not a lot of the population.
It must be lonely being there and being frustrated with what you see around you with your fellow humans, right?
Well, you sort of, I guess, if you're actually at that 0.5%,
what if you're there?
What you do is adapt to being at only 0.5% of the population. And so you'll notice that it's hard to find like a deep friendship with somebody who you can feel heart to heart with.
Right.
It's not a big deal. I mean, because you're stuck with it. So what are you going to do?
Maslow talked about this. Maslow talked about this in his book about transcenders. Transcenders, he called them. And he said that transcenders have a cosmic sadness toward their fellow humans.
Right.
They see the greater potential in them. Right. I always thought that was beautiful.
Well, that is a great part of a higher stage of development.
Oh, Ken, thank you so much for chatting with me today and for the legendary work you've done in your career.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate today's conversation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.